The sun had barely risen over Los Angeles when the silence of a suburban mansion was shattered by a scream. Inside, Victoria James, 5 months pregnant, stood frozen in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she placed a plate of scrambled eggs on the table. Her heart raced, not because of the food, but because she sensed something far more dangerous. Ryan Carter, her husband, entered with Sophie Miller clinging to his arm. Neither tried to hide their affair anymore. Sophie's smirk dripped with arrogance, while Ryan's eyes glowed with the cruelty of a man who no longer cared about his wife. "Sign the divorce papers, Victoria," Ryan demanded coldly, tossing a folder across the table. His voice was sharp, stripped of every ounce of warmth it once carried. "And forget about this baby. You have no place in my life anymore." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She pressed a protective hand against her belly, whispering, "This child is innocent, Ryan. He doesn't deserve this." But before she could plead further, Sophie stepped forward, her high heels clicking against the hardwood floor. In her manicured hand gleamed a pair of scissors, long, sharp, terrifying. She raised it, pointing directly at Victoria's neck. "If you won't leave willingly," Sophie sneered, "we'll make sure you do." Ryan joined her, grabbing another pair of scissors from the counter. The metallic sound of the blades opening and closing filled the room, echoing like a death sentence. Victoria stumbled backward, her back pressed against the cold marble island of the kitchen. Her knees shook, but she refused to fall. Her mind raced. What about my parents? What about my unborn child? Is this how my story ends? Betrayed by the man I trusted most? Ryan lunged forward, the scissors grazing her skin, leaving a thin red line across her throat. A sharp sting spread down her neck, and Victoria gasped in horror. Sophie laughed, her voice shrill. "Look at her shake, the mighty Mrs. Carter reduced to nothing but a pitiful woman." Tears blurred Victoria's vision. She prayed silently for a miracle, clutching her belly as though her embrace could shield the child inside. She thought of her father's words, whispered years ago, "Never let anyone take your dignity, Victoria." But how could she fight back when 2 predators stood inches from her life? Just then, the heavy front door slammed shut. Footsteps echoed across the hallway, growing louder, more forceful. Ryan and Sophie froze, exchanging a quick glance, their scissors still raised. The kitchen door swung open. Standing there was Alexander Reed, Ryan's boss and one of the most powerful men in New York. His sharp eyes instantly caught the glint of steel pressed against Victoria's throat. His jaw tightened, and his voice thundered across the room. "What the hell is going on here?" Victoria's knees buckled in relief, but fear still clung to her chest. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself to hope. Because the man who just walked in had the power to destroy Ryan's world, or save hers. Long before scissors were ever raised against her, Victoria James had been a woman full of quiet dreams. She grew up in a modest household on the outskirts of San Diego, the only daughter of a factory worker father and a schoolteacher mother. Her parents raised her with values of honesty, sacrifice, and unconditional love. They often told her, "One day, Victoria, you will find someone who protects you as we always have." At 24, she thought she had found that man. Ryan Carter was charming then, dressed sharply, spoke sweetly, and promised her the world. To a young woman with little experience in love, he seemed like the answer to every prayer. Her parents hesitated at first, worried that Ryan's ambition overshadowed his compassion, but Victoria insisted. She was blinded by his attention, his grand gestures, and the idea of building a future together. For a while, life was good. Ryan's career in real estate blossomed, and they moved into a spacious home in Los Angeles. Victoria left her job as a hotel receptionist to focus on preparing for a family. She wanted nothing more than to create a warm home where laughter could fill the halls. But the warmth faded quickly. Ryan grew distant, coming home later and later, always with excuses. The smell of perfume lingered on his suits. When Victoria asked gently if something was wrong, he would snap, "Don't start, Victoria. You're lucky I provide for you. Stop being ungrateful." The insults cut deeper than any blade. Nights alone in their big, cold house became routine. Victoria often sat by the window, her hands on her growing belly, whispering lullabies to the child she hadn't yet met. She told her baby, "You're my reason to keep going. No matter what happens, Mommy will protect you." Her parents noticed the change. They saw the light dimming in their daughter's eyes. Her mother called often, urging her to visit, but Victoria refused to burden them. She carried her suffering in silence, believing that enduring it was better than shaming her family with a broken marriage. Even her friends drifted away. At gatherings, whispers followed her. Some suspected Ryan's betrayal, but none dared to speak openly. Victoria felt trapped in a cage of appearances, forced to smile while her heart slowly fractured. Still, she hoped. When she discovered she was pregnant, she believed it might bring Ryan back, that fatherhood could soften his hardened heart. She imagined him holding their child, rediscovering the love they once shared. But instead, the pregnancy only widened the gulf. He mocked her changing body, avoided her touch, and spent more nights with Sophie Miller than with his wife. Victoria clung to faith. Every night, she knelt by her bed praying, "God, give me strength. Don't let my child grow up without love." But the silence that answered her prayers was heavy, almost suffocating. And so, by the time that terrible morning arrived, the morning when 2 pairs of scissors threatened her life, Victoria was already a woman broken by betrayal. Yet deep inside, hidden beneath her tears and fears, was a spark waiting to ignite. The question was, who would light it? The Carter mansion sat on a quiet street in the wealthy suburbs of Los Angeles. From the outside, it looked like the picture of success. Tall palm trees swayed in the driveway, expensive cars glistened under the sun, and the white stone walls shimmered like something out of a luxury magazine. Neighbors often glanced at the house with admiration, whispering about how fortunate Victoria must be to live in such splendor. But inside, the mansion was nothing short of a prison. The grand foyer, with its marble floors and sweeping staircase, echoed with emptiness. The dining table, long enough to seat 12, was often set for just one. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the ornate grandfather clock, reminding Victoria of the hours she spent waiting for a husband who rarely came home. Every room told a story of neglect. The living room, decorated with velvet couches and gold-framed paintings, was a stage for arguments rather than laughter. The master bedroom, once a place of intimacy, had become cold and divided. Ryan sleeping on one side, Victoria alone on the other, the space between them wider than the ocean. Even the nursery she had carefully prepared, with pastel colors and tiny clothes, remained untouched, its innocence clashing with the bitterness that seeped through the house. Victoria often wandered through the halls at night, her bare feet brushing against the cool marble tiles. She would pause by the tall windows, gazing out at the city lights in the distance, yearning for freedom. But no matter how far she looked, the glass reflected back a woman trapped, her reflection blurred by tears she didn't dare shed in front of anyone. The mansion became a symbol of her suffering. To outsiders, it represented wealth. To Victoria, it represented isolation. She remembered her parents' modest home in San Diego, where laughter filled every corner despite the peeling paint and squeaky floorboards. That tiny home had been rich with love, while this mansion, dripping with luxury, starved her of affection. Her few friends who visited would compliment the chandelier or the sprawling backyard, but they never noticed the tension in the air. Ryan had trained Victoria well to put on a mask. She smiled politely, offered them tea, and hid the bruises of her heart. Once they left, she sat alone, staring at the same walls that felt closer every day, pressing in on her until breathing itself became a chore. Even the staff, maids, gardeners, drivers, sensed the coldness. They did their jobs quietly, rarely speaking unless spoken to. One maid in particular, Mrs. Lopez, often glanced at Victoria with pity. She had seen bruises Ryan left during arguments, though Victoria always lied, claiming she had slipped or fallen. The mansion silenced everyone, turning secrets into shadows. And so this grand estate, worth millions of dollars, was nothing but a gilded cage. Each morning, Victoria woke up surrounded by wealth, but starved of love. Each night, she lay in a king-sized bed but felt smaller than ever. The mansion was a stage, and soon it would host the cruelest performance of all. The morning Ryan and Sophie turned from betrayers into would-be killers. Ryan Carter had once been the kind of man who could charm an entire room. With his sharp suits, polished smile, and confident stride, people mistook him for a gentleman. But behind closed doors, away from the flashing lights of business dinners and cocktail parties, he was a different man entirely. His charm was nothing but a mask, hiding his arrogance, selfishness, and hunger for control. He had married Victoria with promises of devotion, but deep down, Ryan never saw her as a partner. To him, she was an accessory, someone to cook, clean, and carry his child while he climbed the social ladder. When she stopped being the perfect trophy wife in his eyes, he turned cold. To Ryan, love was disposable and loyalty was a joke. Enter Sophie Miller, the woman who fanned the flames of his cruelty. Sophie was younger, bold, and shamelessly ambitious. She worked under Ryan in his real estate office, but her ambitions went far beyond selling houses. She wanted status, wealth, and power, and she quickly realized Ryan could give her all three. Her beauty was her weapon: red lips, long hair, and a smile that concealed venom. Sophie played her role well. She flattered Ryan's ego, laughed at his cruel jokes, and whispered poison into his ear about Victoria. "She's holding you back," Sophie often said. "You deserve a woman who matches your power, not someone weak and pathetic." Ryan, eager to feed his pride, believed her. Together, they became a toxic pair, bound not by love but by greed and lust. Nights that should have been spent with Victoria were instead spent in hotel rooms, plotting how to push her out of the picture. Ryan told himself he was only doing what any man of ambition would do, trading up. Sophie told herself she was destined to replace Victoria, to live in the mansion and wear the title of Mrs. Carter. But their ambition had a darker edge. It wasn't enough to betray Victoria in secret. They wanted to humiliate her, crush her spirit, and drive her away completely. Sophie enjoyed watching Victoria suffer, her laughter echoing every time she caught Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Ryan, intoxicated by Sophie's approval, grew more ruthless by the day. Their cruelty escalated. What began as insults turned into threats. What began as lies turned into schemes. They whispered about forcing Victoria to sign divorce papers, about taking the baby from her, about leaving her with nothing. And as their desperation grew, their methods turned violent. Ryan bought into Sophie's vision of a future without Victoria, blinded by lust and greed. Sophie fueled him with promises. Once she's gone, the house, the money, the life, it's ours. They convinced themselves that destroying Victoria was not only necessary, but inevitable. So when they stood in the kitchen that fateful morning, scissors glinting in the light, it wasn't a sudden outburst. It was the culmination of months of cruelty, months of betrayal, months of feeding each other's darkest desires. And they believed, with Victoria cornered, that nothing could stop them now, until an unexpected figure walked through the door. The night after the attack, the mansion was quiet, but inside Victoria James's heart there was no peace. She sat curled up on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the thin blanket around her. The wound on her neck stung with every breath, but the deeper wound, the one carved into her soul, throbbed much more painfully. Her sobs came in waves, breaking through the silence of the vast, empty room. She buried her face into her hands, whispering through tears, "Why me? Why would the man I love turn me into his enemy?" Each word cracked, echoing in the emptiness like a confession to the walls that surrounded her. Victoria had always believed in endurance. She had endured the insults, the late nights alone, the humiliation of Sophie flaunting herself at Ryan's side. She endured it all for the sake of her unborn child, convincing herself that love could still be salvaged, that a father's heart could still change. But now, with the sharp memory of scissors against her throat, she knew those illusions were dead. She stood and walked slowly toward the nursery, her bare feet brushing against the polished wooden floor. The soft pastel walls, once painted with hope, mocked her now. Tiny clothes hung neatly in the closet, untouched. A small crib waited in the corner, decorated with ribbons her mother had lovingly tied. Victoria gripped the edge of the crib, her tears dripping onto the mattress. She whispered to the baby she carried, "I'm so sorry. Mommy doesn't know how to protect you anymore." Her body shook as she remembered Ryan's eyes that morning, cold, unrecognizable, filled with a violence she had never imagined possible. Sophie's laughter still rang in her ears, cruel and sharp. The thought of raising her child in a world where its own father wished it away crushed her spirit. For the first time, Victoria allowed herself to think the unthinkable. Maybe I am too weak. Maybe they will win. She collapsed to the floor, her knees buckling under the weight of despair. The chandelier above cast shadows that stretched across the room, long and distorted, making her feel even smaller. She clutched her belly tightly, as though holding on to the only piece of hope she had left. But her heart whispered dark thoughts. What if Ryan takes the baby? What if Sophie becomes the woman who raises my child? The terror of that image sent her into a fit of sobs so heavy she could barely breathe. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, but she couldn't gather the strength to reach for it. Friends had stopped calling months ago. She didn't want to face her parents, didn't want them to hear the trembling in her voice. Pride, shame, and fear all chained her in silence. The hours crawled by. Her body ached from crying, her eyes swollen, her voice hoarse. She curled up on the nursery floor, clutching her belly as if it were the only anchor left in her sinking world. But in the darkest hour, when she was most certain her strength had run out, a light was about to enter her life in the most unexpected way. Days after her breakdown, Victoria James looked into the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were swollen from nights of crying, her hair dull and unkempt, her spirit nearly extinguished. But beneath the exhaustion, a flicker of determination stirred. She realized she could no longer remain the same fragile woman Ryan and Sophie had tried to destroy. For her unborn child, and for herself, she needed to rise. Alexander Reed noticed the shift too. Unlike anyone else in her life, he saw the strength buried under her fear. One afternoon, he invited her to his office in New York. The towering skyscraper mirrored his presence, commanding, unshakable, filled with purpose. He spoke firmly but with compassion. Victoria, you've survived the unthinkable. That alone makes you stronger than both of them combined. But now it's time to show the world that strength. At first, she hesitated. Her voice trembled as she said, I don't know if I can. I've been broken for so long. Alexander leaned closer, his tone steady. They counted on that. They built their power on your silence. But silence is over. Those words ignited something inside her. Victoria agreed to start small. She began attending meetings with Alexander, not as a broken wife, but as a woman learning to stand tall. He introduced her to stylists, who helped her shed the image of a timid, forgotten wife. Gone were the plain dresses and muted colors. In their place, she wore sleek outfits that reflected confidence and grace. Her hair was styled with care, her makeup soft yet radiant. The mirror no longer mocked her. It revealed a woman reborn. But the transformation wasn't only on the outside. Alexander arranged for her to meet mentors, women who had also endured betrayal, loss, and abuse, yet built new lives from the ashes. Their stories fueled her spirit. She journaled her thoughts every night, turning pain into purpose. Slowly, she stopped crying herself to sleep. She began walking with her shoulders back, her chin lifted, her eyes steady. Even her parents noticed the change when she visited them. Her mother held her hand, tears of pride streaming down her face. That's my daughter, she whispered. Her father, usually quiet, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're stronger than I ever imagined. The more Victoria stepped into her new identity, the more Ryan and Sophie's power faded. They no longer haunted her thoughts every hour. Instead, she thought about the future she wanted for her child, one built on dignity, strength, and love. She practiced speaking firmly, rehearsing words she once feared to say. No longer would she bow her head to humiliation. No longer would she let betrayal define her. Each morning, she stood in front of the mirror, whispering, I am not broken. I am not weak. I am Victoria James. By the time the next confrontation came, she was ready. The frightened woman who had once crumpled on the nursery floor was gone. In her place stood a mother, a fighter, and soon an avenger, prepared to face Ryan and Sophie, not with tears, but with power. The night of the gala arrived, a grand charity event hosted at one of New York's most luxurious hotels. Crystal chandeliers glowed above a sea of polished marble, and the air buzzed with the chatter of the city's most powerful figures. Ryan Carter, ever hungry for influence, strutted into the ballroom with Sophie Miller draped on his arm. They thought they had secured their place in society, certain Victoria was long gone. But they were wrong. All eyes turned when Victoria James entered, escorted by Alexander Reed. The room hushed, whispers rippling like a wave. Gone was the broken woman they once pitied. Tonight, she wore a sleek black gown that accentuated her strength, her posture regal, her presence commanding. Even the sharpest socialites lowered their gazes as she walked by, her confidence undeniable. Ryan's smirk faltered. Sophie tightened her grip on his arm, her smile twitching. "What is she doing here?" she hissed under her breath. Ryan clenched his jaw, forcing a grin for the crowd. "Ignore her. She won't dare cause a scene." But Victoria had come for exactly that. The gala reached its peak when the host invited Alexander Reed to the stage. As he spoke about integrity and leadership, Victoria stood nearby, her heart pounding but her eyes steady. When Alexander finished, he turned the spotlight toward her. "There is someone here tonight with a truth that needs to be heard. Mrs. Victoria James." Gasps filled the room. Ryan's face drained of color. Sophie's hand shook as she set down her champagne glass. Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking with purpose. She took the microphone, her voice clear and strong. "For years I lived in silence. I endured betrayal, cruelty, and humiliation at the hands of the very man who vowed to protect me. While I carried his child, he carried on with another woman. And when I refused to disappear quietly, they threatened my life with scissors in my own home." The audience erupted with murmurs, shocked eyes darting to Ryan and Sophie. Ryan tried to laugh it off, raising his hands. "She's lying. She's bitter because I left her." But his voice cracked, betraying his fear. Victoria didn't flinch. She raised her chin and signaled to Alexander. Screens around the ballroom lit up with video footage, grainy security camera clips from that fateful morning. The images were undeniable. Ryan and Sophie, scissors in hand, cornering a terrified Victoria in the kitchen. Gasps turned into outrage. "You wanted to silence me," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But tonight, the truth silences you." Ryan's mask shattered. Sophie's face twisted in horror as people began to step away from them, as though betrayal itself were contagious. The once celebrated couple was now the scandal of the night, exposed before the very society they had craved to impress. And then came the applause, not polite, but thunderous, echoing through the ballroom as Victoria stood tall. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was winning. And Ryan knew his empire of lies was crumbling right before his eyes. The fallout from the gala was swift and merciless. Within days, Ryan Carter's name was splashed across headlines, not for business triumphs but for scandal and disgrace. The video of him and Sophie threatening Victoria with scissors went viral, shared on every platform. Public outrage boiled over, demanding justice. Investors pulled out of his company, partners cut ties, and soon his once proud real estate empire collapsed into dust. Sophie Miller, desperate to save herself, abandoned Ryan almost immediately. She denied everything, claimed she was manipulated, and fled the city with another man who promised her a fresh start. But the damage was done. Ryan was left with nothing. No career, no reputation, no mistress, and no wife. He stood alone, a man stripped of the very power he had worshipped. The law soon followed. Charged with domestic abuse, attempted assault, and endangerment of a pregnant woman, Ryan was dragged into court. The same halls where Victoria once trembled now echoed with his downfall. This time, she stood strong, testifying with unwavering eyes, her voice calm and clear. The jury found him guilty, and the judge's gavel struck with finality. Ryan Carter, once the charming man who dazzled crowds, was sentenced to years behind bars. Victoria left the courtroom not as a victim, but as a survivor. She carried herself with dignity, holding her baby close in her arms. The applause of strangers who admired her courage followed her steps. She had not only reclaimed her life, but had become a symbol of resilience for women who had endured the same silent battles. In the months that followed, her life transformed in ways she never imagined. Alexander Reed, who had stood by her through her darkest nights, became more than a protector. Slowly, their bond deepened, not rushed, not forced, but built on trust and respect. He never treated her as fragile, he treated her as equal. And in his arms, Victoria found the love she had once dreamed of, this time real and unshakable. Their wedding was simple yet beautiful, surrounded by people who truly mattered. Her parents sat in the front row, tears of joy streaming down their faces as they watched their daughter finally receive the love she deserved. Her friends, once distant, now cheered with pride, humbled by her courage and transformation. The moment Alexander slipped the ring on her finger, Victoria felt the final pieces of her broken heart come back together. But the most powerful moment came when she stood with her baby, her child, the reason she had fought so hard. She whispered, "We made it, little one. Mommy kept her promise." The child's laughter filled the air, a sound of healing that no wound could silence. Victoria James's story was not one of tragedy, but of triumph. She had been betrayed, humiliated, and nearly destroyed. Yet she rose from the ashes, stronger than before. And as she walked hand in hand with Alexander, her baby nestled safely in her arms, the message was clear. No betrayal, no cruelty, no darkness could ever defeat the strength of a woman who chose to fight for her dignity and her future. In the weeks after the trial, Victoria James returned to her parents' home in San Diego. For the first time in years, she walked through the familiar doorway not as a frightened wife, but as a woman free from chains. The moment she stepped inside, her mother rushed forward, wrapping her in a warm embrace. "You're safe now, my child," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her father, usually a man of few words, placed a steady hand on her shoulder and said simply, "We're proud of you." The small house was nothing like the mansion she had left behind. The walls were faded, the floors creaked, and the furniture carried decades of use. Yet here, surrounded by love, Victoria felt richer than she ever had in luxury. The house smelled of home-cooked meals and fresh coffee, and laughter filled the rooms once again as her parents cooed over their grandchild. Her baby became the center of everyone's world. Victoria would often sit by the window, rocking the infant to sleep while her parents watched with joy. "This little one will grow up knowing strength and kindness," her mother said, kissing the child's tiny hand. Victoria nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "And he will never know the darkness we left behind." Still, healing wasn't simple. Some nights, Victoria woke from nightmares of scissors flashing in the kitchen. She'd jolt upright, clutching her baby close, her breath ragged. On those nights, her father would sit quietly beside her, reminding her she wasn't alone. "The past can't touch you anymore," he would say. Slowly, his words sank in, and the fear began to loosen its grip. Friends who had once turned away now came back, humbled by her courage. They apologized for their silence, admitting they had suspected Ryan's betrayal, but lacked the bravery to confront it. Victoria accepted their apologies, though she didn't forget. She had learned the hard way who truly stood beside her in times of need. Amid this healing, Alexander Reed remained a steady presence. Though busy with his empire, he made time to visit San Diego often, never pushing, never demanding. He played with the baby, listened to Victoria's fears, and encouraged her dreams. "You've already proven your strength," he told her one evening as they walked through her parents' garden. "Now it's time to build the life you deserve." Her parents noticed the tenderness in Alexander's eyes, and the way Victoria's laughter grew freer in his company. They exchanged knowing glances but said nothing, allowing love to blossom naturally. For Victoria, the healing process was about more than romance. It was about reclaiming herself. She began journaling daily, writing letters to her unborn hopes and unspoken fears. She enrolled in online courses, determined to return to the workforce someday, not out of necessity, but out of pride. Each small step built a new foundation, one that could never be shaken by betrayal again. Her life was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she was creating. And with her parents' support, her child's laughter, and Alexander's quiet strength, Victoria realized that she was not just surviving, she was beginning to truly live again. While Victoria James was rebuilding her life, Ryan Carter was watching his own crumble beyond repair. Once hailed as a promising businessman, he now walked through the city streets with lowered eyes, his once polished shoes scuffed, his tailored suits traded for cheap jackets. People who used to greet him with admiration now crossed the street to avoid him. His name, once a ticket to high society, had become a stain whispered with disgust. The courtroom conviction had destroyed more than his freedom. It had shattered his pride. Stripped of his business, his investors, and his influence, Ryan found himself jobless. No firm wanted to hire a man whose face was plastered across news outlets as a symbol of betrayal and abuse. He applied for work in smaller offices, but each interview ended the same: cold eyes, polite rejection, and doors closing in his face. At home, the collapse was worse. The mansion, once filled with extravagance, stood nearly empty. He sold off cars, furniture, even jewelry to pay mounting legal fees. The marble floors that once gleamed now echoed with loneliness. He drank to numb the silence, but even alcohol couldn't drown the memories of Victoria's strength. On that gala stage, the way the audience applauded her while he stood disgraced. Sophie Miller, the woman he thought would stand by him, proved to be as selfish as he had been. At first, she played the role of the supportive mistress, promising they would rebuild together. But when the money dried up and the invitations stopped coming, her patience thinned. She snapped at him for the smallest things, mocked his failures, and finally walked out. The final blow came when he returned home one night to find Sophie's side of the closet empty. A note sat on the dresser in her perfect handwriting. "You're finished, Ryan. I won't sink with you." She had left with another man. Wealthier, more powerful, everything Ryan could no longer provide. Alone, Ryan stared at the empty space where Sophie's belongings once were. Rage consumed him, but beneath it was something worse: despair. He realized he had destroyed the one person who had ever truly loved him, Victoria. And for what? For a mistress who discarded him the moment life grew difficult. Neighbors began to gossip openly. They spoke of how far he had fallen, how poetic it was that the man who once humiliated his wife now lived in shame. Some even pitied him, but most celebrated his downfall as justice. Ryan, once admired, had become an outcast, a living cautionary tale. Nights were the hardest. He lay in his empty bed, haunted by visions of Victoria's eyes at the gala, steady, fearless, victorious. He replayed the moment she revealed his betrayal to the world, the gasps of the audience, the applause that followed. The sound echoed in his head like a punishment that would never end. And as he drifted into restless sleep, Ryan faced the truth he could no longer escape. He had lost everything. Not to chance, not to misfortune, but to his own cruelty. And there was no one left to blame but himself. For months, Alexander Reed remained a steady presence in Victoria James's life. He never rushed her, never demanded her affection. Instead, he gave her space to heal, to rebuild, and to rediscover who she was without fear. Yet with every passing day, their bond grew stronger, quietly weaving itself into something deeper than either of them had expected. It began with simple gestures. He visited San Diego often, bringing small gifts for her baby. A teddy bear one week, a blanket the next. He joined her family for dinner, laughing at her father's old stories and listening to her mother's advice as though he were already part of the family. In those moments, Victoria saw not the billionaire CEO, but a man who valued loyalty and love above status. One evening, after helping her rock the baby to sleep, Alexander lingered by the window, the moonlight reflecting off his sharp features. "Victoria," he said softly, "you've carried more pain than anyone should bear. But I want you to know, you don't have to carry it alone anymore." His words touched her like a balm, reminding her of the safety she had longed for. Still, Victoria hesitated. Her heart, though healing, carried scars. She worried about opening herself again, about trusting love after betrayal. But Alexander never pressured her. He simply stayed, proving through actions what Ryan never could through words. Slowly, her guard began to lower. They started taking walks together, pushing the stroller through the park. She laughed more freely, rediscovering a part of herself that had been buried. Alexander, who was used to boardrooms and deals, found joy in the simple rhythm of family life. Holding the baby, sharing ice cream, watching Victoria's eyes light up when she talked about the future. It was during one of these walks that Alexander gently asked, "What do you dream of now?" Victoria paused, her eyes drifting toward her child. "I dream of a home filled with love, where he grows up never doubting his worth. I dream of never living in fear again." Alexander smiled, his hand brushing hers. "Then let's build that dream together." Her parents noticed the change. Her mother whispered to her one night, "He looks at you the way your father once looked at me. That's rare, Victoria. Don't let fear steal it from you." Her father nodded, adding quietly, "A man like that doesn't come twice." One evening, Alexander invited her to his penthouse in New York. The view overlooked the city skyline, a sea of light stretching endlessly. "This could be your new beginning," he said, his voice steady. "Not in my shadow, but by my side." Victoria looked out at the city, then down at her baby sleeping in her arms. For the first time, she felt hope not just for survival, but for happiness. she realized she was no longer defined by betrayal. She was defined by the love she was brave enough to accept. For months, Victoria James had lived quietly in San Diego, healing in the safety of her parents' home and the steady support of Alexander Reed. But whispers of her story had spread far beyond her neighborhood. People who once gossiped about her humiliation now spoke of her courage. By the time she returned to Los Angeles for her first public appearance, society was waiting, not to mock, but to watch. The occasion was a charity fundraiser hosted downtown, an event attended by many who had once turned their backs on her. As Victoria stepped from the car, Alexander at her side and her baby in the care of her parents, the cameras flashed. Reporters murmured her name with awe, not pity. She wore a navy blue dress that exuded quiet power, her posture tall, her expression calm. Inside the ballroom, conversations paused as she entered. Familiar faces from her past, the same women who had whispered behind her back at social luncheons, the same men who once praised Ryan, now turned to look at her with something close to respect. She felt their eyes tracing every step, but for the first time, it didn't make her shrink. It made her stronger. One woman approached, a former friend who had distanced herself during Victoria's darkest days. "Victoria?" She began awkwardly. I owe you an apology. I believed the lies. I didn't stand by you when I should have." Victoria held her gaze for a long moment. The old Victoria might have bowed her head, accepted the apology in silence, but the woman standing here now lifted her chin and replied softly, "It's never too late to do the right thing." Throughout the night, more people came forward, neighbors, colleagues, acquaintances, all acknowledging the strength she had shown. Some offered apologies, others simply admiration. The same society that once watched her fall was now watching her rise, and Victoria embraced it, not with arrogance but with grace. Alexander stood close, quietly proud, but he let her shine. He knew this moment wasn't about him. It was about Victoria reclaiming her place in the world. When people congratulated her, she answered not with bitterness, but with gratitude. She spoke about resilience, about protecting her child, about finding strength when she thought she had none. Every word carried the weight of her journey, and those listening were moved. The highlight of the evening came when the host invited Victoria to speak. Taking the stage, she glanced around the room at the very people who had once doubted her. Her voice rang steady. "There was a time when I thought silence would protect me. But silence only feeds cruelty. It was only when I spoke the truth, when I refused to hide, that I found freedom. To every woman here who feels trapped, your voice has power. Don't let anyone take it from you." Thunderous applause filled the room. Many had tears in their eyes, touched not just by her words, but by the strength they saw in her presence. Victoria James had returned to society not as the broken wife of Ryan Carter, but as a woman reborn, respected, admired, and unstoppable. It was a quiet evening in New York when Alexander Reed finally decided to share the truth he had kept hidden for years. Victoria James had just tucked her baby into bed in the guest room of Alexander's penthouse. The city skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting soft light across the room. She walked into the living area to find Alexander standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, his expression unusually heavy. "Victoria," he began slowly, "there's something I should have told you a long time ago." She tilted her head, sensing the seriousness in his voice. "What is it?" Alexander took a deep breath. "Your father, Thomas James. He saved my life once. Without him, I wouldn't be here." Victoria's eyes widened. "My father? But how?" Alexander turned to face her, his eyes steady. "Years ago, when I was still building my business, I made a mistake. I trusted the wrong people. The deal went south, and I was left vulnerable, one step away from losing everything. Your father was working as a financial advisor at the time. He didn't know me well, but he saw what was happening and chose to help. He risked his own career to expose the fraud that would have destroyed me. Because of him, I not only survived, I built the empire I have today." Victoria's heart swelled with pride and surprise. She remembered her father's long hours, the way he often said, "Integrity is everything, even when it costs you." She had never known the details of his sacrifices. "He never told us," she whispered. "That's who he was," Alexander replied softly. "He didn't want recognition. He believed helping someone in need was reward enough. I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I would repay him. When I saw what you were enduring, Victoria, I knew this was that chance. Protecting you, it wasn't charity, it was an honor." Tears welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from a deep sense of connection. Her father's legacy had unknowingly tied her to Alexander long before they had met. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "So all this time you were keeping his promise alive?" Alexander nodded. "Yes, but now it's more than that. At first, it was about honoring him. But somewhere along the way, it became about you, your strength, your courage, your heart. I don't just see you as someone I'm protecting, Victoria. I see you as someone I want by my side for the rest of my life." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the city below. Victoria's chest rose and fell as she absorbed his words. For so long she had felt like a burden, someone saved out of pity, but now she understood. She wasn't a burden. She was a blessing, a continuation of her father's integrity and love. She reached out, her hand brushing his. Their eyes met, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe in love without fear. Because this was no accident. This was fate, written years ago by the sacrifices of a father, now fulfilled in the arms of the man who had kept his promise. The woman who once trembled in silence was gone. Victoria James woke each morning now with a sense of purpose, no longer weighed down by fear or shame. Her days were filled with small victories, each one a brick laid on the foundation of her new life. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was becoming someone her past self would hardly recognize, a woman of strength, dignity, and vision. Her transformation showed in every detail. She no longer dressed in muted colors meant to blend into the background. Instead, she chose bold, elegant outfits that spoke of confidence. Her posture carried authority. Her voice no longer wavered when she spoke. Even in simple conversations, people listened differently now. They sensed the change, the resilience forged in the fire of betrayal. Victoria began using her story not as a source of shame, but as a weapon of empowerment. With Alexander's encouragement, she accepted invitations to speak at women's organizations and charity events. Standing before audiences filled with strangers, she shared her journey, the silent suffering, the near-death mourning with the scissors, and the courage it took to rise again. Her honesty moved people to tears. Women approached her afterward whispering, "You gave me the strength to leave," or "I thought I was alone, but now I know I'm not." Her parents watched proudly from the sidelines. Her mother often clasped her hands, saying, "You've become the woman we always knew you could be." Her father, once hesitant to show emotion, told her softly, "Your strength is your inheritance, Victoria. It's what your child will carry too." Her baby grew alongside her transformation. Each giggle, each tiny step reminded her why she had chosen to fight. She promised herself her child would never grow up in a house filled with fear. Instead, he would grow up surrounded by love, courage, and the example of a mother who never gave up. Alexander stood by her, but he didn't overshadow her. He was her partner, not her rescuer. He celebrated her victories, encouraged her independence, and gave her space to shine. To him, Victoria wasn't just the woman he loved, she was an equal, someone whose spirit inspired even him. One evening, as they prepared for another gala, Victoria caught her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back. The haunted eyes were gone, replaced by a fire that burned with certainty. She touched her scarf faintly, the faint mark left by Ryan's scissors. Instead of shame, she felt pride. It was proof of survival, proof that she had faced the darkest night and walked into the light stronger than ever. When she entered the ballroom that night, heads turned, not because she was Alexander Reed's companion, but because she was Victoria James. Her name no longer carried pity. It carried power. Whispers followed her again, but this time they were filled with admiration. The world had tried to break her, but instead, it had created a woman unstoppable, unshakable, and ready to claim the future she deserved. For all the strength Victoria James had found, life was not free of challenges. Even love, as pure and steady as the one she had begun to share with Alexander Reed, was tested in ways neither of them expected. Theirs was not a fairy tale, it was a partnership forged in fire, and fire always came with sparks. It started when rumors spread in the press. A tabloid published photos of Alexander leaving a late-night business meeting with a glamorous businesswoman. The headline screamed, Reed's new flame? Though the story was baseless, whispers followed Victoria wherever she went. People wondered if history was repeating itself, if yet another powerful man would betray her. For Victoria, the memories were too fresh. She stared at the article in silence, her hands trembling. The scars of Ryan's betrayal reopened, her chest tightening with panic. Could she trust again, or was she doomed to be fooled twice? When Alexander arrived at her parents' house the next evening, she confronted him. Her voice shook but held firm. "Tell me the truth, Alexander. Am I just another name in your life, another woman who will be discarded when someone better comes along?" Alexander's eyes softened. He stepped closer but didn't touch her. "Victoria, look at me. I would never betray you. That meeting was business, nothing more. But I understand why you're afraid. You've been hurt so deeply, you expect the wound to reopen. But I need you to see me for who I am, not for who he was." Her eyes welled with tears, torn between fear and hope. "Do you know how hard it is to believe that? Do you know what it feels like to watch the man you loved put scissors to your throat?" His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at the memory. "I know," he said quietly. "And that's why I've devoted myself to proving I'm nothing like him. Love isn't just words, Victoria. It's consistency, it's patience, it's showing up even when it's hard. Let me keep showing you." For the first time she realized this was not just about trust in him. It was about trusting herself again. She had the power to choose differently this time, to see with clear eyes instead of blinded ones. Their test did not end there. Weeks later, when Alexander invited her to a business dinner, she was seated at a table filled with men who whispered behind their hands. "Isn't that Ryan Carter's ex-wife?" one murmured. "She must be using Reed for money," another scoffed. Victoria heard every word. Once, those comments would have shattered her, but she lifted her glass calmly and met Alexander's eyes. His silent nod gave her courage. She smiled and said to the table, "I don't need a man's fortune to define me. I stand here because I chose to rise after everything tried to bury me." The room fell silent. Alexander reached for her hand under the table, his grip firm, his pride unmistakable. That night proved their love wasn't fragile. It was forged in trials, strengthened by truth, and ready for anything still to come. The day finally came when Alexander Reed asked Victoria James the question she never thought she would hear again. "Will you marry me?" It wasn't a grand gesture in front of flashing cameras or crowded audiences. It was in her parents' backyard in San Diego, under the soft glow of string lights, with her child giggling in the grass. Alexander knelt on one knee, holding a ring that sparkled but could never shine brighter than the sincerity in his eyes. Victoria's breath caught. For a moment, her mind traveled back to the days of betrayal, fear, and humiliation. But then she looked at Alexander, the man who had stood by her through every storm, the man who had restored her faith and love. With tears glistening in her eyes, she whispered, "Yes." Her parents embraced her, overcome with joy. Her mother sobbed openly, while her father, ever the stoic man, cleared his throat and said gruffly, "It's about time." The moment was filled with warmth, laughter, and the promise of a future untainted by the shadows of the past. But not all hearts celebrated. Miles away, in a cramped apartment that smelled of stale liquor and regret, Ryan Carter saw the news online. Photos of Victoria's engagement spread across social media, her radiant smile beside Alexander's steady gaze. Ryan's hands shook as he scrolled, rage boiling inside him. "She's mine," he muttered through clenched teeth, though he knew she no longer was. The world had moved on without him, and the woman he once tried to break was now soaring higher than he ever imagined. The bitterness consumed him. Sophie had left long ago, and loneliness gnawed at him like a disease. Each night he replayed the past, convincing himself he had been wronged, that Victoria had stolen his future. In reality, he had destroyed himself. But denial was easier than truth. Watching her prepare for a wedding with a billionaire only deepened his misery. Meanwhile, Victoria flourished. She and Alexander planned a ceremony not for spectacle, but for meaning. She chose a venue by the ocean, waves crashing gently in the background. The guest list was filled not with empty socialites, but with people who had truly stood by her. Her parents, close friends, mentors, and women she had inspired through her story. Her child toddled at her side during fittings, his laughter filling the room as she tried on dresses. Each detail of the wedding symbolized rebirth, a new chapter free of cruelty. Still, Victoria knew the shadow of Ryan lingered. She sensed it in the way her name still appeared in tabloids, in the way whispers of his bitterness reached her ears. But unlike before, she no longer trembled. Instead, she pitied him. "He can watch all he wants," she told Alexander one evening. "But he'll never touch me again. My life is no longer his to destroy." Alexander kissed her forehead. "That's right, because this time, Victoria, you're walking into a future you built for yourself, with love that can't be broken." And as the wedding day drew closer, Victoria stood taller than ever, ready to step into her new beginning, while Ryan remained trapped in the ruins of his own making. The ocean stretched endlessly under a golden sky, waves rolling gently against the shore as the guests gathered for the wedding of Victoria James and Alexander Reed. The ceremony was set on a cliffside overlooking the Pacific, a place chosen not for extravagance but for meaning. The horizon symbolized what Victoria's life had become: limitless, open, and full of hope. Her parents sat in the front row, their faces glowing with pride. Her child, dressed in a tiny suit, toddled down the aisle carrying a small ring pillow, drawing soft laughter from the crowd. The atmosphere was not one of rigid formality, but of warmth, family, and resilience. Everyone present knew this was not just a wedding, it was the closing of one story and the radiant beginning of another. When Victoria appeared, the guests rose to their feet. She wore a gown of soft ivory, simple yet elegant, its flowing fabric catching the ocean breeze. Her scar, faintly visible on her neck, was left uncovered. She had chosen not to hide it. To her, it was not a flaw but a symbol, proof that she had survived the cruelty that once tried to end her. As she walked down the aisle, whispers of admiration rippled through the crowd. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a queen. Alexander's eyes never left her. For a man who had conquered boardrooms and empires, nothing had ever humbled him like this moment. When Victoria reached him, he took her hands gently, and for a moment the world around them seemed to vanish. The officiant began, but it was their vows that left not a single dry eye among the guests. Alexander spoke first, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Victoria, when I first saw you, I saw pain. But soon I saw strength. You showed me what it means to fight with grace, to survive with dignity, and to love without fear. Today I promise you my loyalty, my respect, and my heart, for as long as I live." Victoria's voice trembled slightly as she began, but her eyes were firm. "Alexander, you entered my life when I thought I had no reason to hope. You didn't just protect me, you reminded me of who I was. I vow never to let fear silence me again, and I vow to stand by you as you stood by me. Together, we will build a life not defined by wealth or power, but by love, truth, and the family we cherish." As their vows ended, the officiant declared them husband and wife. Alexander kissed her softly, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Her parents embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces. The baby clapped his tiny hands, unaware of the weight of the moment, yet somehow part of its beauty. For Victoria, this was more than a wedding, it was closure. She was no longer the woman held hostage in her own home, trembling before scissors at her throat. She was a wife by choice, a mother by love, and a survivor by destiny. And as the waves crashed below, she knew the past had finally been buried beneath the tide, leaving only the promise of tomorrow. Married life with Alexander Reed was nothing like what Victoria James had once known. Their home in New York was a penthouse filled with light, laughter, and warmth. Expansive windows overlooked the city skyline, but the true beauty lay inside. Victoria decorated the space not with extravagant luxuries, but with reminders of family. Framed photos of her parents, drawings from her child, and flowers that Alexander made sure were always fresh on the table. Every morning began with peace. Victoria would make breakfast while her child babbled happily in the high chair, and Alexander, often dressed in a sharp suit for the office, would steal moments to play peekaboo before rushing off to meetings. In the evenings, he returned not with excuses or bitterness, but with stories of his day, eager to hear hers in return. They were equals, partners in every sense. Victoria also continued her advocacy work, speaking at events for women who had endured abuse. Each time she took the stage, she carried her scar proudly and shared her story with unshakable courage. She became a voice for the voiceless, turning her pain into purpose. Alexander encouraged her every step, often standing in the crowd, applauding louder than anyone else. Her parents visited often, thrilled to see their daughter thriving. "You've built a home of love," her mother told her one evening. "This is what you always deserved." Her father, quiet but emotional, lifted her child into his arms and said, "And this little one will grow up knowing what family truly means." But while Victoria was blossoming, Ryan Carter was withering. After serving time, he returned to the world a shadow of the man he once was. His name was poisoned, his career obliterated. The mansion that once stood as his pride had been seized, and now he lived in a dingy apartment with peeling paint and unpaid bills stacked on the counter. He often sat in darkness, staring at a half-empty bottle, replaying memories of what he had lost. Sophie Miller, long gone, was just another ghost in his mind. She hadn't looked back, leaving him to rot alone. He scrolled through social media sometimes, his hands trembling with rage as he saw photos of Victoria and Alexander, smiling, happy, glowing with love. It was a knife twisting deeper each time. Neighbors whispered about him. Once he had walked through crowds with pride. Now people crossed the street to avoid him. Some pitied his fall, but most saw it as justice. "That's what happens when cruelty runs out of control," one neighbor muttered. Nights were the worst. Ryan would wake drenched in sweat, haunted by the sound of applause from Victoria's public triumphs. He heard her voice echoing in his nightmares, steady and fearless, exposing him before the world. He slammed bottles against the wall, screamed at shadows, but nothing silenced the truth. He had destroyed himself. Meanwhile, in New York, Victoria rocked her child to sleep while Alexander wrapped his arms around her. She whispered softly, "We're safe, we're free. This is our forever now." Her world was a life reborn, while Ryan's world was nothing but ashes and regret. With her new life firmly established, Victoria James realized her story was not hers alone. She had survived betrayal, humiliation, and violence, but countless other women were still trapped in silence, suffering as she once had. And so, with Alexander Reed's unwavering support, she began building something bigger than herself. A foundation dedicated to helping survivors of domestic abuse. The foundation quickly gained momentum. Victoria traveled across cities, Australia, speaking at conferences, shelters, and community centers. She shared her scars without shame, telling her story with raw honesty. "If they could try to break me and I could still stand here today," she would say, her voice steady, "then you can too. No one has the right to silence your voice." Audiences rose to their feet, applauding her courage. Media outlets praised her transformation from victim to advocate. Even political leaders invited her to speak on reform. Victoria had become more than a woman who survived. She had become a leader, a beacon of hope. Her child grew up surrounded by this love and strength, often toddling around her office as volunteers and staff adored him. Her parents visited often, proud to see their daughter turning pain into a purpose that changed lives. And Alexander, though powerful in his own right, often stood quietly in the background, letting Victoria shine. He knew this was her destiny, and he loved her all the more for embracing it. But while Victoria's influence spread like wildfire, Ryan Carter's world continued to shrink. His bitterness festered. He lived in shadows, clinging to the belief that Victoria's success was built on his ruin. Night after night, he sat in his apartment, staring at news reports of her speeches, his face twisted with jealousy and rage. He slammed his fists against the table, muttering, "She stole everything from me. My life, my reputation, that should have been mine." One night, drunk and shaking, he decided he couldn't bear it any longer. He convinced himself he needed to confront her, not to apologize, but to reclaim what he believed was his. He scribbled plans, looked up her foundation's events, and whispered to himself, "She thinks she's safe. She thinks she's untouchable. But she'll see me again." Ryan's desperation grew darker. He began following Victoria's appearances, staying on the edges of crowds, his hood pulled low. Security often pushed him back, but he blended into the background, watching her, seething as she stood on stage, radiant and untouchable. Victoria, though unaware of his presence, sometimes felt a chill at events, a lingering sense of danger. Alexander noticed it too. "We'll increase security," he told her firmly. "You've built too much to let shadows from the past threaten you now." But Ryan was determined. In his twisted mind, He believed one last confrontation could restore his power. He didn't care about law, about consequences. He cared only about dragging Victoria back into his darkness. And as Victoria prepared for her largest event yet, a national conference where thousands would gather to hear her speak, Ryan made his decision. He would be there, waiting, ready to make his final move. The conference hall in New York buzzed with anticipation. Thousands had gathered, eager to hear Victoria James speak. The stage was set with banners carrying the message of her foundation: voices cannot be silenced. Reporters filled the aisles, cameras ready to capture every moment. To the world, this was another step in Victoria's rise. But to Ryan Carter, lurking in the shadows near the back, it was his chance for revenge. Victoria walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Dressed in a white suit, she radiated calm strength. She began her speech, her voice steady as she shared her story of survival and transformation. "There was a time I thought silence was safer than truth," she told the crowd. "But silence nearly cost me everything. Today I stand here not just for myself, but for every woman who thinks she has no way out." The audience hung on her every word, but Ryan's blood boiled with every sentence. His fists clenched in his pockets, sweat dripping down his brow. In his mind, she wasn't inspiring. She was mocking him, standing on a stage built on what he believed he had lost. When Victoria paused for breath, Ryan made his move. He pushed through the crowd, his voice cutting through the silence. "Liar," he shouted, his face twisted with rage. Gasps rippled through the audience as heads turned. Security rushed forward, but Ryan shoved past them, storming toward the stage. "You ruined me, Victoria. You stole my life, and now you stand here pretending to be some hero?" The crowd erupted in chaos. Some screamed, others pulled out phones to record. Security tightened their grip, but Ryan's fury gave him strength. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "You were nothing without me. Nothing." For a moment, the hall froze. The old Victoria might have cowered, her voice swallowed by fear. But the woman standing on stage now refused to bend. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on him, her voice strong enough to cut through the noise. "You're wrong, Ryan," she said clearly, her words echoing through the microphone. "I was never nothing. You tried to make me believe that, but I found my worth without you. And everyone here sees the truth. You didn't destroy me. You made me stronger." The audience roared in support, clapping, shouting her name. Ryan's face twisted with despair as the walls closed in. Security finally wrestled him down, dragging him toward the exit as he screamed curses that no longer carried power. His voice, once domineering, was drowned out by the thunderous applause of a crowd standing behind Victoria. Victoria's chest heaved, but she didn't falter. She looked at the audience, her voice trembling with both strength and emotion. This is why we speak. Because silence protects abusers, but truth exposes them. Today isn't about him, it's about us and the future we are building together. The crowd rose to its feet, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the hall. Alexander, watching from the front row, stood too, pride and love in his eyes. And as Ryan was dragged into the darkness for the last time, Victoria stood in the light, finally free from his shadow forever. The echoes of Ryan's furious shouts still lingered in the conference hall, long after security dragged him away. For a moment, tension hung heavy in the air, as if the audience collectively held its breath. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Victoria James, standing tall on the stage, her chest rising and falling as adrenaline pulsed through her veins. It would have been easy to break down, to collapse under the weight of such a confrontation. The memory of scissors pressed against her throat could have silenced her once again. But Victoria refused to give fear the final word. She gripped the podium with steady hands and lifted her head high, her voice cutting through the unease like sunlight after a storm. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone calm but powerful, "what you just witnessed was not strength. It was desperation. It was the cry of a man who thought he could define my life and lost everything when he realized he could not." The crowd erupted into applause, their clapping not only for her courage but for the truth she spoke. Cameras zoomed in, capturing her face, strong, unflinching, radiant. She continued, her voice filled with conviction. "I know many of you in this room have faced your own Ryans, people who told you that you were nothing, that you had no voice, no worth, no way out. And maybe, like me, you believed them for too long. But let me tell you this. They were wrong. You are not powerless. You are not worthless. You are survivors, and you are capable of rewriting your story. A murmur of agreement swept through the audience. Women in the crowd dabbed at their eyes, some nodding vigorously, as if she were speaking directly to them. Victoria placed a hand on her scar, letting the cameras capture the gesture. This scar is not a mark of weakness. It's proof of survival. Proof that even when someone tried to erase me, I refused to disappear. And every single one of you has that same power inside you. Alexander, watching from the front row, felt his chest swell with pride. He knew this moment would define not just her journey, but her legacy. The hall, once shaken by fear, now vibrated with energy and hope. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting her name. Victoria! Victoria! The chant grew louder, a wave of support drowning out the memory of Ryan's venom. Reporters rushed to capture every word, headlines already forming in their minds. Survivor turns attack into victory, and Victoria James inspires thousands after Confrontation. When the applause finally softened, Victoria closed her speech with words that would echo far beyond the hall. The past tried to break me, but standing here, I declare to every survivor, your future belongs to you, not to the ones who hurt you. Speak your truth, live your strength, and never ever let anyone steal your voice again. The ovation was thunderous, rolling through the room like a wave of triumph. People hugged each other, inspired by her courage, and as Victoria stepped down from the stage into Alexander's waiting arms, she knew that what had begun as her nightmare had become her greatest message of hope to the world. Ryan Carter sat alone in his dim apartment, the walls stained with years of neglect, the air heavy with the smell of stale liquor and cigarettes. The blinds were half broken, allowing slivers of city light to creep in, casting shadows that mocked his loneliness. Once, he had lived in a mansion filled with luxury. Now he existed in a hollow room where silence was his only companion. The world had forgotten him. After his failed outburst at Victoria James's conference, the media turned him into a cautionary tale. Headlines labeled him the fallen husband, and from power to pathetic. Clips of him screaming at Victoria were replayed across television screens, contrasted with her calm defiance. The public's sympathy, once thin, had evaporated entirely. He wasn't seen as a man anymore, just a warning. Friends? Gone. Business partners? Long since vanished. Even Sophie Miller, the mistress he once sacrificed everything for, had cut ties completely. Rumors said she had moved abroad with another wealthy man, living the life Ryan always wanted but could never provide. The betrayal stung, but it also mirrored his own cruelty. He had abandoned Victoria for Sophie, only to be discarded in the same heartless way. Ryan replayed his life in fragments. The charm he once used so easily, the arrogance that fed his ego, the cold satisfaction of holding power over Victoria. At the time, it had felt intoxicating. But now, as he stared at the empty bottle in his hand, all he felt was shame. He remembered the look in Victoria's eyes when she stood on stage, her voice rising above his rage. That look haunted him more than any prison sentence ever could. The loneliness gnawed at him. Nights stretched endlessly, each darker than the last. Sometimes he spoke aloud to the empty room, muttering, "I was supposed to win. She was supposed to beg me to stay." But the silence that answered mocked him. His health began to fail. Without proper meals or care, he grew thin, his once sharp features hollowed. Neighbors whispered about the man who rarely left his apartment, the one who used to flaunt wealth and now looked like a ghost. Some pitied him, others sneered, but no one reached out. He had burned every bridge, and now the ashes offered no comfort. One night, sitting by the window, he saw an online clip of Victoria again, this time holding her child, smiling alongside Alexander. She looked radiant, her life full, her future secure. Ryan slammed his fist against the sill, rage boiling for a moment before collapsing into despair. Tears streamed down his face, not from love, but from the bitter truth. He had lost everything, and it was his own doing. There was no redemption waiting for him, no grand comeback. Just the long, slow decay of a man who once thought himself untouchable. And as the city lights flickered outside, Ryan Carter realized he was not just alone in his apartment, he was alone in the world, forgotten, while the woman he tried to destroy lived on in triumph. Years had passed since the day Victoria James first stood trembling in her kitchen with scissors pressed against her throat. That moment, once her deepest nightmare, now felt like a distant memory compared to the life she had built. What was once pain had transformed into purpose, and what was once betrayal had become the foundation of her greatest strength. Her foundation, Voices Cannot Be Silenced, had grown into a national movement. Shelters expanded across cities, offering safety and resources to women and children in need. Hotlines saved lives every day, and policies began to change as lawmakers listened to her testimony. The scar on her neck, once a reminder of terror, became a symbol of resilience. When she stood at podiums, holding her child in one arm and speaking to crowds with unwavering conviction, she embodied survival itself. At home, her life was filled with love. Alexander Reed was no longer just the man who had saved her. He was her husband, her partner, her confidant. Their marriage was built not on appearances, but on honesty and trust. Even in his world of wealth and influence, he cherished the simple moments most. Cooking dinner together, reading bedtime stories, walking hand in hand through the park. Their love was steady, equal, and unshakable. Her parents, who once feared for her life, now lived in peace, surrounded by the joy of their grandson. They often visited, marveling at the transformation of their daughter. "You've turned your scars into wings," her mother told her one afternoon. Her father, his voice gruff but warm, added, "And you taught us all that dignity can never be stolen, it can only be surrendered. And you, Victoria, never surrendered." Her child grew surrounded by this love, learning strength not from lectures, but from example. He knew his mother had once faced darkness, but what he saw was light. A woman who fought for justice, who turned fear into courage, and who taught him that kindness was the truest form of strength. As for Ryan Carter, his name faded into nothing. Few spoke of him anymore, and when they did, it was only as a cautionary tale of arrogance, betrayal, and downfall. He was forgotten by society, while Victoria's name was etched into history. His cruelty had tried to silence her, but instead it had amplified her voice to the world. On the anniversary of her foundation's creation, Victoria stood before a crowd of thousands. Cameras flashed, but she focused on the people. Women holding their children, survivors standing tall, families reunited. She spoke with the same fire that had carried her through the years. "I once believed my life was over, but today I know it was only beginning. We are not defined by what breaks us, we are defined by how we rise, and together we will rise." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, voices chanting her name. She looked at Alexander, who smiled with pride, and at her child, who clapped along joyfully. And in that moment, Victoria James knew her legacy was secure. Not just survival, not just justice, but hope, a light that would shine long after her story was told. So that's how the story ends, my wonderful friends. You're still here with me, right? If you've stayed until now, it means something in this journey has touched your heart in a way words can't quite explain. And maybe that's because, deep down, we all carry scars, and we're all searching for healing. The Stoics once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Victoria's story reminds us of that truth. No matter what breaks us, we can rise stronger, braver, and more alive than ever. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs hope, hit that like button, and subscribe to join our family here. Because together, we're not just watching stories, we're living proof that pain can become power, and that no voice should ever be silenced.